So wonderful to see familiar faces. Jean, good afternoon.
Hi. Hi.
Uh,
I see I'm too low. Just a minute here. Gotta get a higher chair.
I'm going to do a quick introduction.
Good.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good to see you from all over the world. Wendy, thank you for joining us again. Madiha, thank you for joining us. Of course, Syra from New York. So lovely to see familiar faces time and time again. Really warms my heart. This is live chat number 22. And it's Jugalbandi series number 6, which means it's the 6th time that we have the privilege and honor of having Jean Gardner with us. Most of you who I see on here have been following these chats, and I'm really glad to see familiar faces come back, a few new faces. For those of you who are new, Lamia, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us from Boston afternoon. So we have a lot of people from EST scheduled today, Eastern Standard Time. I hope you're all well and safe and keeping an eye on the riots and the protests and keeping yourself looked after. In the meantime, 45 degrees in Karachi. Even though it's 11 o'clock at night, it's probably dropped to late 30s. You can probably see some of the humidity on my face. That's my excuse for shiny skin. But here we are, and we are going to get into another chit-chat session. I have some intrusive questions for Jean today. So already looking disturbed. So we've been talking about, thank you, Lamia. We've been talking about all sorts of different ways of constructing identity, redefining it, looking at the role of heritage and cultural heritage, geometry, alignment, the human relationship to these sacred buildings, our relationship to the earth, and the bigger, grander scheme of things. Some of it is spiritual, some of it is organic and earth, tangible and dirty, some of it is architectural, some of it is cultural and poetic and all about storytelling. So as these different pieces are being put together, I thought today would be a great time to actually go back to the beginning of identity. We've looked at a lot of what could be a new direction coming out of the identities of the ancient worlds from this region. And when I mean this region, I mean Indus, the Indus Valley civilization, Mesopotamia, Iraq, and potentially even Egypt. So this is where we're at for those of you who needed a quick synopsis, catch up on what we're doing. And we're beginning to look at how to map the future, post-pandemic, digital age, the role technology will play. Bilal, lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us from Dubai. This is fabulous. So, Jean, now that you're set and your camera is at the right location, you're looking settled and waiting for me to keep quiet. So here's the multi-million-dollar question. I know that you have mentioned your personal and spiritual affiliations with the Navajo and the Native Americans. But, you know, I wondered, once I had put the title down for our topic today, it was too late to correct. I didn't want to do the whole thing again. I was just being lazy. But I wondered if instead of saying genetic and spiritual, if I should have said genetic and geometric lineage. I think that would have been so much more fun if we looked at the geometry that connects us through all of these different scales and spaces of environments. We've been talking about space and time getting collapsed and what do we do with this collapse and how will it play out in the future. Of course, again, the word play comes into play. What can you tell us about your genetic and geometric identity?
Well,
where does one begin?
If anybody, especially you, expect me to answer your question directly, you're in for a surprise. When Zen said to me, "Oh, let's talk about maps," and then on Thursday, Wendy Brower's coming, the map queen of the world.
Yes, she's here.
So I said to myself, "Well, what's a map? You know, forget if it's genetic or spiritual, but what is a map?" And you'll never guess, Zen. This is such a confirmation of something you've been, you know, hanging around in the periphery of our conversation. I didn't have enough time to go back any further than Latin, MAPPA. And guess what it was? A flag to start a game.
Oh my God, that's crazy. That's
I know.
crazy. Why didn't you tell me this before?
I
No.
only knew it. I only knew it this morning. This morning.
That's
You know, because
unbelievable.
people, I like to know what the word means that
Yes,
I'm talking about.
right,
And I've gotten to the point where I realize that every language is a map of things that are unspeakable in the body.
right.
So from that point, I realized that everything is a map. What you just did at the beginning of this session
Yes.
laid the ground for what we were talking about over time.
Mm.
And what I just said about everything, diagrams, geometry, roads, maps, all of these are framing what we perceive. And this has been one of our through lines. Here we
Yes.
are, the rug has been pulled out from under us. Okay, what's that mean? Well, it means the map of what we know has been pulled out from under us. So you and I have been saying, okay, let's in effect make a new map. And it basically, as much as we can, not be framed by the printing press, the digital, whatever other means, which is everything, the calendar, the clock, all of these are maps. And then I realized a map is an app. It's a shortcut to a particular reality, a particular opinion, a particular perception. So at that point, I thought, woo, I can say anything today. He may want me to talk about spiritual maps or geometric maps, but the mere asking of the question is a map of you. So I'd like to know when you first got interested in maps and how it led to these ancient maps. Pakistan is a line on a map overlaid on the earth. The map is not the territory. And you've been trying to get to the territory.
True.
And that's basically, the ground has been pulled out from under us. That's also, we weren't on a very solid ground. So what is it that got you thinking this way, that you wanted to get down to the territory, earth, terra? Okay, so.
So that's it. It's not a question I was prepared for, but it's also a difficult one, because what has happened is once I left Pakistan as a child, and I was in the UK in the 80s, and in 1980s, the level of racism in the UK was very basic. You were either Paki or you were not. So what we heard in the newspapers and the little bit of ruffian activity, the muggings, the hate crimes that happened were predominantly either homophobic hate crimes, or they were what they call Paki bashing. And that was predominantly because their jobs were being taken, the same old story, right? And I would see it or I'd hear it. I have to admit that I was lucky enough to not face it myself. Wandering around London as a 14-year-old or 15-year-old, coming back and forth from school to spend the weekend with my family, I would see people getting harassed and bullied, but luckily it didn't bother me. And that used to make me wonder, how is it that I bypassed this? And the answer to that, very much like you said, actually exists in the very question, that when somebody met me, they would not be able to place me, because they all had preconceived notions of what a Pakistani would look like. And essentially, they should look like the Indian. And you were either, first guess was, are you Indian? And if not, then they would say, are you Pakistani? And at that time in the 80s, the Arabs really didn't play a role because as far as the Western world was concerned, the Arabs still lived in tents on sand dunes and rode camels. So yeah, I mean, it was obnoxious. And but not obnoxious because they were doing it maliciously. It's the
Mm.
same thing that we talk about, that history had been held back from them. Just like history by design had been held back from us, it had also been held back from them. So it's not like they had decided that we are going to 15, 16, 18-year-old children would know the difference. If they didn't have the information, where would they have made that judgment from? They just didn't know. So it used to always stick in my mind. I would look at the person who was asking me the question, where are you from? And try and ascertain what is it that they wanted to know. Were they trying to place my skin color? Were they trying to place my features? Were they trying to place my accent, my English? And it was really interesting. They were trying to create a map in their minds, with or without prejudice, let's leave that aside, but they were trying to figure out where to place this creature. And they were intrigued and they were curious. And maybe someplace at the bottom of that curiosity, there was a slight animosity, but I have to say, I think for me, it was entirely curiosity. Then I arrived in the US and the curiosity increased because I spoke with the Queen's English. And again, I didn't fall into the people had known Pakistanis to either own the bodega at the corner stores, and they looked a certain way, and they spoke a certain way, and they behaved a certain way. Or they were taxi drivers, and they had their own profiling. So then lo and behold, I arrive, and I remember clearly, I was coming from the UK, and of course my English was fine, and they expected me. They said, you know, you've been taken in, but we need you to sit for the TOEFL. And the TOEFL was an exam that stood for Test of the English as a Foreign Language. And I remember standing in the office saying, I'm not, this is humiliating. I'm not going to sit for this exam because my English is better than yours. I mean, you can hear me. This is hard. So we had a good laugh. The two of us, you know, the admin person writing this, they said, you're absolutely right. And, you know, but this is just administrative stuff that we have to do. So, you know, these are little germs of thought process, of constructing my own map. Then I came back to Pakistan in the mid 90s, and I'd been through all these years of fantastic education between the US and the UK. And I started looking around thinking, gosh, I feel like a tourist in my own country. Now I'm asking myself, who are you? So I started my self-touring through the shrines, through the different parts of the country in the mid 90s to try and find out, where did I belong? And you know, the funny thing is, Gene, and I don't mind saying this, so one place was when people would ask me, where are you from? And then say, oh, really? You're from Pakistan? Oh, and I thought, we also have blonde, blue-eyed, sharp Greek-nosed people in Pakistan. And we have dark, curly-haired Aborigine folks in Pakistan. And we have people like me. And we have people that look like, quote-unquote, the stereotypical Indian. So I'm like, what part of Pakistan do you think I should look like? The northern areas, the central pieces, or the southern ends, or the corners, the borders? Which end? And, you know, so that diversity of Pakistan caused confusion in my mind to say, okay, which box do I fit in? Like, what do I tell them? So I started the exploration and then discovered that people spoke other languages beyond Urdu. Urdu was just the tail end of what we inherited. Actually, they were indigenous languages, which I didn't know. And of course, English was taught to us as a first language. So myself and my generation are thinking in English most of the time, at least at that point. So I started listening to the music and getting to the poetry, and my grandmother taught me a lot of the old Iqbal and the Faiz and the Rumi. I dug it all back out from my library and I started rummaging through it to see which of this resonated. And the pieces that resonated, I followed. And then I went back to New York. I remember when I went back to New York in 2000, suddenly New York lost its depth for me because I'd been to the shrines, I'd seen so much more of Pakistan, having not seen much of it before, and I knew nothing of the Middle East till much later. So now I'm back in New York, and 9/11 happens, and people asking me, where are you from? So it suddenly became an even more intriguing, fascinating question, because then you think, okay, why does this person want to know? And I have to tell you that it's so much fun. Identity is so much fun to play with at airports when you arrive at immigration. And so I remember in 2011, I went back for a friend's wedding to London. And so I'm doing Karachi, London, direct flight on PIA. And it was an empty aircraft, yada, yada, yada. I got the front seat. So I get out of the aircraft. I'm the first 3 passengers. And at Heathrow Airport, there's all these little booths with the immigration officers waiting to receive the passengers. They know that the first 10 passengers are coming out either of first class or business class. So they know you've got out of the nose of the plane. Of course, I arrive in a fitted t-shirt. My tattoos are showing. I'm in jeans. I'm dressed comfortably for a long 8-hour flight. I'm not dressed to hide my fear or hide my insecurity. I would see people come out in suits, really well dressed, as if they're going for a job interview because they're so afraid of being inappropriately profiled. So as you arrive at Heathrow, they have the section for the British passport holders. They have the lines for the EU passengers, for the naturalized citizens. They have 5, 6 different lines. And then they have my favorite line says, other. So I go into other. And I'm the only idiot in other. Because everybody else has dual nationality. Or they're British citizens of some sort, or Europeans. So this one man who looked at least Pakistani of all of them arrives with a green Islamic Republic of Pakistan passport, and he's sent into the other line. It was fantastic. So I see these 3 booths and they're looking at me. I can see the questions, the confusion in their faces, saying, what do we do with this man? What is that language on his arm? Is it Arabic? Is it Urdu? The recipe for biryani? What is it? So I rock up and I speak fluent English. Imagine.
Yes.
It was the best thing. And you know what the second layer of that's interesting is, first, they are shattered by the fact that I don't fit the profile that they have written down on their little folders, which have all been laminated because they've constantly been paging them. So every page has been laminated. So this tacky plastic document that they have to go through pages and pages. And I'm looking at it thinking, God, that's a horrible job. Why are you here? And a wedding, when are you leaving? I'm leaving in 3 days. You've flown all the way from Pakistan for 3 days? I'm like, yes. What else would you like me to do here? Well, you've grown up here. Yes, I have. I have a few friends. Well, they're coming to the wedding, so I don't have to spend time going out to see them. And they were just baffled. It was the most beautiful conversation. I wish I'd recorded it because it broke down so many preconceived prejudices, things that are shaking the world today, have been around throughout. And the best bit is, as he's leafing through my passport, because there's a stack of 6 passports that I travel with, there's a visa for India and China and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and parts of Europe. And they're thinking, oh my God, he must be a drug dealer, right? Because who travels much? So I was like, listen, don't smoke, don't drink. You've got the wrong man. And they can see from my teeth I don't smoke. So we actually ended up talking about my tattoos because the immigration officer had a tattoo. He rolled up his sleeves. We talked about it. It all dissipated. But you know what's interesting is that the breakdown, the final nail on the coffin that freed me from his prejudice was that I had a stamp that said PhD student, Columbia University. And so I went to a very fancy boarding school in the UK. He recognized that. Then, of course, I went to Parsons. Everybody knows Parsons. But the Columbia stamp, that's it. He said, you're a doctorate student? I said, I was once upon a time when I could see and chew and my liver function, but today I'm not a PhD student. But he saw that stamp, and that was the end of his questions. So it just makes you wonder, why did I need that validation? I had proved him wrong in every question up to that point. So the question of who am I and what is my identity and why don't I fit into the genre that they want me to fit into was wonderful. Then I came back here in 2010, and in Dubai, they're very particular about where are you from, and you know, all sorts of reasons of where you're from, because it's such a mixed culture. There's Lebanese, there's Egyptians, it's such a melange of all sorts of different people. So it makes sense when everybody, the first thing they ask you is, where are you from? You know, what do you do? Where are you from? It's an icebreaker, so it makes sense. So I came back to Pakistan. I thought, God, this question is just dogging me. Where am I from? And why does it matter so much? But of course it did matter, because in my relationships it mattered. If I dated somebody who was from the East, I would have to constantly be explaining the Western side of my life. And if I dated somebody who was Western, English speaking, didn't understand the Rumi or the Sufi music or the Qawwali or the Hal or the Iqbal poetry, then I would be explaining that, going through old films, translating poetry, and it became really difficult in both situations. So I thought, if I'm going to be this hybrid, I need to still have an idea of what my authentic roots are. So I don't need that stamp in my passport to validate my existence and my identity as, he's okay. You know? So
If they only knew.
if they only knew. So the
You were
discovery,
okay. You're okay.
yes. I mean, so the thing is, once I started speaking to the guy, he relaxed. But the man that I walked up to was an extremely confused and afraid individual and nervous. He didn't know what language I would speak, if I would speak any language that was comprehensible to him. And of course, I speak a fairly decent version of the Queen's English at that time to him. His English, I was having trouble understanding, and he was a British national. So in 2010, this whole idea, as I wandered around the country gathering moss, and by gathering moss, I started gathering this community of friends who had similar questions. What is our culture? What does it mean to be Pakistani? What do these boundaries really mean? What do they restrict us from? What are they constricting us from? And what is the region about? So as I rummaged through the papers, the old maps, the books, the stories, my interest in mapping my own lineage became more and more interesting. And I started sharing that story. There are so many people who are on our chat today who've been on this journey with me. And I say this to them, that this is a personal journey. I don't have any definitive answers to your questions. Let's go and let's ask the questions ourselves. Let's go on this journey. Let's be led by the universe, be led by the music, be led by the sound of the dunes moving in the desert, and see where it takes us. What music resonates with you, what people, what food. And over the years, I've picked and chosen. So I've realized, I know where my grandmother was from. You know where your grandmother was from. I know where my grandfather was from. But it's loose. And it's about the region. So I arrive in Turkey and they think I'm Turkish. I arrive in Barcelona, they think I'm Spanish. I arrive in Uzbekistan and some of the people think I'm from Samarkand. And you think, wait a second, is that possible? So that possibility is what has enchanted me to pursue this. And in fact, it is possible that in my genetic trail, in my lineage, that there are little fractions and fragments of these people, same as with yours. Maybe you go back to Egypt. Maybe you can be traced back to Spain or France or Scotland, or even, there might even, because of the Silk Route, trading from Samarkand to Ireland, there is a possibility. It may be very, very small, but somewhere on the line, even you and I are connected genetically. So that exploration began. I thought, let's start reconstructing this map of who we are, not as suffocating political boundaries that are economics based right now, and power based and oil based, but based on capitalist greed. Let's free ourselves and move back to a different era. Find our forefathers, find our ancestors, see if we can be quiet enough to listen to their stories and their whispers through these buildings. And that's what I've been doing for 8 years. And I just go out, I tell people, this is where I'm going. Would you like to come with me? And they do. It's just that.
I feel like I'm going to burst into tears.
No.
That was so powerful. That was so powerful.
Bless you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And
Honest truth. All of it is the honest truth.
That's why it's so important. The seeming contradiction that we've been exploring, the paradox. Here I am sitting in the Delaware River Valley, and there you are sitting in the Indus River Valley, and space and time have collapsed, and we're both having our struggles because the map of time and the sun and our sleeping patterns aren't identical. So here we are talking to each other. And a few weeks ago, I was the one getting up too early, half asleep. Now you're staying up really late. So these maps and what we always thought of as contradiction. So what you just explored was the fluidity over the Silk Route, how genetics can follow if they get a swab out of our mouth, starting in Africa, and how we got, if we're lucky, to where we are now. So this fluidity, which is the global community. So now we're living it, and these contradictions you have experienced. And maybe it's genetically explained, but you used a word several times that created pulsing in me. In other words, my heart just leaped. And it's this word, resonance. When you got back to where you were born. And there are very, very, I think, legitimate explanations. The place you're born is set, your nervous system, when you are coming out of the womb in that place, your nervous system is set by the planetary magnetic fields. So when you come home, you are what's called Om.
Om.
The Big Bang. The world bursts because it's so resonance. If you can find the territory, not all these maps, like you said, that have been laid on us, that set up expectations and then blind us to this extraordinary resonance, which is not speakable. Perhaps, like you're calling this exchange between us, Jugalbandi. And that to me was perfect. Two of us sit down and we're playing off of each other by resonating. What is it that you said map and I said, well, what about you? In other words, nobody has a playbill.
Right.
And that is so important in this exploration that we're doing. I mentioned about genetics, and there are two prominent ways that you can have your DNA explored that are, one of them was available to the public and no longer. And that's the one that the National Geographic magazine and a scientific group, and I didn't have time to look it up, together asked for people to send their swab, and then they would map it from its origin, not from where they were now, which Ancestry.com, places like that, start from where you are and work back. Right. So I sent mine, and everyone that went to this National Geographic experiment, together, the results began to map the routes that we took out of Africa. So the mapping was dependent on the evidence they were getting, not on any preconceived idea of where we started. But of course, even the word Africa is a map distinction. So that place, and we know that it's very likely that the landmass of the Earth was once one. You can even see where they fit together. So I don't want to, I mean, it's very confusing because then language immediately creates expectations and, like you said, confusions. How could we all have come from there? Well, that piece of territory is where now we understand that we all originated, and then they were able to follow your route out of Africa. Like two of my friends who are in Puerto Rico, they each had theirs done because I was doing mine, and one got to Puerto Rico via going west through Italy and through Greece and Italy and Europe, and then finally Puerto Rico. The other one went across the Bering Strait and came down. And now they're both Puerto Ricans. So they did it because I did it. But what happened with me, and I think the story that Zen, he's holding out the bait. He's saying, "Hello, will she tell it?"
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
let me see if she'll actually say it. So they could trace mine to ancient Egypt, but they didn't have anyone with a DNA like mine that went further. So there was nothing, you know, there was no way for them to map my DNA onto the physical ground. So there I was. And ancient Egypt in the West for so long was about as far back as history went. I mean, we knew there was another part of the earth, but that was the beginning. And because of my interest in geometry, I know that nothing I learned about Egypt in school told the story. The architectural story was completely bloodless. You know, you recognized a floor plan where you knew what the Sphinx was, but you never knew what it meant to the Egyptians. So by that time I had the DNA done, I had begun to study esoterically Egypt. And I started having extraordinary dreams associated with Luxor, which some of you may know has the greatest concentration of sites, building sites, that align with meridians and what we might call the whole nervous system of the earth. Ley lines, that's another word for them. In other words, places where these lines cross, and they're very powerful. Stonehenge is on one. I haven't had a chance to look at the Indus Valley temples. All my books, by the way, are in New York City. So, you know, you're hearing ad lib for sure. I can't go and check what I once may have known. So the dreams were, I was associated with a particular complex of buildings, the Hathors. And those are cow-headed embodiments, which is so indicative of how the Egyptians honored the rest of the animal life higher than their own. The pharaohs with their, you know, signifying hat, and then the falcon. Those just, and the way the falcon is protecting, I mean, they just send me beyond. So in the Hathor temple, I was a teacher. And of course, this is before the Christians came. And it is believed that many of the great people who knew, like Pythagoras or the man called Jesus, that where they were, they went to Luxor, and like they were coming from what we now think of as Pakistan and that part of the world, China, they were, and even from what is now Ireland. So these routes that you're talking about, the fluidity was once much more open through some common denominators. that brought all these people, and the common denominator in my mind was the power of the earth in that place, and then understanding how to build so that you could experience it, intensify. The building amplifies those energies. And the Hathors, in the dream, I was going down the hallway to what I knew was the library. And I'm sure most of you knew, and I didn't know before this dream, that the Alexandrian library was not the sole library the Christians sacked. They killed the teachers and burned the libraries all over the part of the world that wasn't, in their mind,
Civilized.
Civilized, yes, the word civilization, exactly. So in the dream, I got to where I thought the library was, and it was totally walled off. So in the dream, I thought, well, I'll just change my vibration and go right through. And I did. So this is why the word resonance means so much to me. Because sound, whether it's heard, or whether it's a group of musicians playing together, or whether it's your body waking up because something outside of it has resonated. So when you said that word, when you came back to that place on the maps that is called Pakistan, and all of a sudden you said, well, who am I? And you kept searching, and things resonated, led you. And that to me is what your edutors are, and what we're what we've started to do. The map has been pulled out from under us, all these relationships that you talked about, and nobody knowing who you are. That happened to the Florentines when it was a city-state, and the pandemic of the 13th and 14th centuries hit. There were people who realized, and this is from firsthand reports, not something that I've deduced, everything collapsed to the extent that there weren't even enough people in Florence to pick up the dead. And we certainly see, you mentioned earlier, the protests going on, protests that are burning because of the anger and the pain and the pandemic. And this particular Giovanni Boccaccio, and everybody who's Italian speaking will be quivering because I have such terrible pronunciation. But he said everything collapsed to the point where you had to decide yourself what was right, what was the right thing to do. So those stories you told, Zen, about talking enough with somebody who had a map that you were supposed to fit into and didn't.
Yes.
You led them to a place where they did what they felt themselves was right. And that's what the map, I think, we're beginning to draw the outlines.
So it's, Jean, I find that over the years, when I started asking myself these questions, and when I go to these places and then I ask the question to the place, who are you? Do we know each other? Is there a relationship here we should explore? Would you like to get to know me? And so when I get into this conversation with these places, I find over the years that I lose faith in what the books have taught us and what the maps have taught us. For example, I was in Iran for 2 weeks in 1999, and their history we knew nothing about till we got there. And all this incredible Persian architecture and their carvings and the Ahura Mazda and incredibly magical creatures and people and stories of their lives carved in stone in the middle of the desert. You think, why has this been kept from me? And I find that history books, whether it's encyclopedias of world history or books that we're taught through architectural history or anything we're taught here in Pakistan about what's happening in the world, gives you such, it's not even the tip of the iceberg. I wouldn't even give it that much credit. That over the years, I've just found myself moving away from these books and away from these maps. I've only recently, in the last 5 years, started digging up maps again. And most maps make me cringe because they're so lifeless and soulless. They're so, like there's a frog stuck in their throat of all these. And I look at these maps, I'm saying, for heaven's sake, spit it out. What is it that you want to say? Because obviously this is not enough. You know, Jean, Luxor, two things hit me in Luxor. I went back to Luxor twice in 6 months. My first trip was in January. I went back in May because so many things didn't make sense to me and so many things did. So for instance, all the carvings inside the underground tombs of Valley of the Kings, you, after the first or second, you see 6 or 8 or 10 in the course of a day, and then you leave the grand finale of King Tutankhamun at the end. The most fascinating pieces of it were the bottom row, and that's where the slaves were. So on any wall, the slaves were at the bottom and the pharaohs were at the top. And the story of their lives and the wars and battles won was in between. And you walk through these hieroglyphic stories painted onto the walls, carved and painted into the stone. Not a single error, like done by computers. I found the ones at the bottom so fascinating because there were these beautiful elongated silhouettes of humans, like Matisse, like Henry Moore, but no heads. So the shoulder went across. It was just this flat thing that, and I just thought, wow, these are so beautiful. So the man carving these would have been that low in the social structure of Egypt. And he would have probably, so it's the same body shape as the pharaoh, only the guy at the bottom has no head. But they were still carved with beauty, with elegance, with grace, with dignity. And I wanted to go back and study those. I said, I would love to just go and look at these. When we came to King Tut's, so you've gone through, imagine, thousands of years of energy is trapped in there. And they let a few people through every year. So not only are you exposed to the old energy, but you're also exposed to the new tourist energy. When I got to King Tutankhamun's tomb, I didn't believe any of it. It just looked fake. And it's astounding because it was done in a hurry. All of the hieroglyphics and the paintings on the wall seemed to me crooked and slightly off. They looked rushed. And we're all taught procession. How do you get from the doorway to the main bedroom? How do you get from the doorway, from the entrance of the gate, through the landscape, through the main foyer, into the dining room? We're all taught the logic of procession. You stretch it, you shorten it, you make somebody turn, you make them climb, you make them go down. So you get familiar with the way the Egyptians had designed the procession for the tombs going down. You come to King Tut's and you don't need to be an 85-year-old archaeologist to know that this doesn't make sense. And I find that the more books we read before we arrive at the places, the more influenced we are with third-hand imperialist thought. Because at Mars, your purity, your childlike intuition is suddenly shaken and it's caged. So I would rather read the books afterwards and say, I don't buy it because I didn't feel it there. So I would love to go back. And now we have research saying that King Tutankhamun's tomb was plonked right in the middle of a journey to someplace else. They think that maybe Nefertiti is behind, but those wall paintings didn't look right. So I think maps, I'm not sure Wendy's still here or not, but maps for me are another version of history holding information back from us. And they're not, I haven't yet come across maps that are soulful and holistic and respectful of the people, the culture, the earth. So I think that as you and I develop this program, it would be really wonderful to find ways of mapping that are not flat. And remember the old books, children's books that used to open up and all the trees stood up in the houses? So those, I think, were much more interesting maps because you could move them around. and look at the map the way you want it to, as opposed to the way the cartographer wanted you to look at it. So I decided in the last, I think, 15, 20 years, that I was tired of seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, and my history through somebody else's eyes, and New York through somebody else's eyes, and London through somebody else's eyes. I want my own mapping of this, because obviously we experience it. I mean, you've lived in New York since the 60s. Your New York is entirely different to mine. Do you remember this, the Cotton Club?
Of course. And then when they moved out of Harlem, they moved right next to where I lived on the Upper West Side. The music,
That's right.
but it wasn't the Cotton Club. I don't remember the Cotton Club. Please, I'm not that old. But I had a firsthand experience, because I don't know what the story is of why they left Harlem, but came to, you know, where I was on the Upper West Side, right next door. So I would hear the music coming up, and I could go down there.
So when I was at Columbia, I lived on 123rd. The Cotton Club was at 125th. At the corner of your building was a phenomenal other place called Birdland.
Yes.
Birdland was also almost as old. It was literally kitty corner to your building. It was right across the street, and they had moved down, refurbished. But the Cotton Club, where Billie Holiday played and Nina played, was at 125th and Broadway. And so we both have our own maps of New York, but the fun would be to say that where were you and I at such and such time in New York, and we recreate those maps like breadcrumb trails, Hansel and Gretel, for all of us. I would love everybody to not depend on a cartographer's version of the map, but all of us pool in our sources and say, here's what the region of Pakistan is a map in my mind. Here's what these parts of Europe are like in my mind. Here's what Scotland's like, or Egypt. And then we do those layers. I mean, I don't know how many people that will require, because you can't go through 4,000 years of people all talking about Pakistan. It's obviously not scalable. But I just feel that there has to be a more holistic way of looking at maps without the clutter and the influence of a third party's agenda. I find that all these other maps have an agenda. They leave out towns, they leave out cities, they leave out critical corners, little villages. They will leave out bits, and they will just blame it on, well, it's not big enough, it's not scale enough. I'm not convinced. So I find that my exploration is now very childlike, that I will go to these places and I will try and speak to them first. The same with Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. I will just sit there for hours. If I'm with friends, I'll tell them, you leave me here, I'll meet you for lunch 4 hours later. And they will want to know what I'm doing. And I tell them, I'm going to be found in the same place where you left me, because I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to talk to her. And they were like, are you crazy? I said, no, go away. I just want to be left alone. And I'm convinced she whispers, because Hagia Sophia has Christian history, it has Saracen history, Ottoman history, it has all of the Suleimaniya history. I mean, so much going on in there. How could she not want to talk to you? They must get lonely.
Well, I think I told you, thank you, because they do get lonely. And it's not only the buildings that we can't hear, because we're moving so fast and we're
Right.
so distracted. In other words, to be able to sit in silence, the response that comes is one that builds in you an understanding of what it is you're actually hearing in the silence. And this, for me, is a very significant moment, because we not only have the pandemic, but which is this microscopic virus that has brought the entire human constructed world in all the ways we're talking about down. But we also have climate change, which is the Earth reaction to our misalignment with them. So what I have experienced and taught by a modern geomancer, who is somebody who can listen to the earth, the stones, the plants, the sky, he just said, we're going to walk in these places. Don't walk, we're not going to walk together. Clear your mind. Stop all the chatter. Walk slowly. The rocks, and he literally said this. I'm not somehow making it. I am telling you what he said. Listen to the stones. Listen to the flowers. And he said, he's from Slovenia, and it was communist all throughout his childhood. But he did have access to the Slovenian local lore. So what we might call folk tales of place. And he said, they're not a metaphor. When a rock tells you where to find water, or a bird in a nest says, hey, what are you doing down there? You looking for me? I can tell you what it's like up here. We need to work together. So, I mean, that's not a Slovenian legend. So, he basically said, look at the legends from where you're from. And that's what you're talking about, because those are true stories. History has the word story in it, S-T-O-R-Y. But the way history is written, like you just described, doesn't store it in our bodies. So, right. In answer to this question about the map, of course, we're speaking English. And you know many more languages than I do. The sound itself is a map. So all these other languages are really important, not for the English word, let's say earth, but what is it in all these other languages? Because everybody's hearing something different because they're from a different place. Not a different earth, but a different sense of what the earth is at that place. For instance, just to get to the one thing you did ask, and there isn't a lot of time to talk about it, but the native peoples of what we call the North American continent, the men who have been pulled away from their, like the Navajos, ancestral lands, but not their permanent. They came across the Bering Strait, I'm convinced. But when they were pulled away and taken into military participation in wars, some of them got sick and died because they're part of the place. They're not on it. They're sprouts out of it. So they couldn't survive. Like the four corners, the four mountains that join four states, but those are superimposed. Those are sacred. And when you are born and live in it, the placenta is buried. I mean, part of you is there and part of your mother. So this idea of resonance, to me, leads to what I hope is not insurmountable. If we know that the representation methods that we use are trying to bring out things that are unsaleable, then do we remain no longer constrained by the maps? So, you threw away the maps, and we're inviting people to make maps, and those maps will tell us about them. And now, like you said, the question is, can we, in this global world suffering from pandemic and climate change, climate emergency, we're all experiencing that. It's different in each place. How do we make each other aware of it and speak to each other with respect, dignity, listening? Rilke has a poem, the German poet Rilke, about Orpheus, the Greek singer who lost his love before they consummated their love, and actually went down into the underworld to try and bring her back, and couldn't quite believe it, and turned around and saw her coming, and of course she disappeared. He had agreed that if they let her out, he wouldn't look. So his music was this plaintive sound that included in life death. And we haven't done that, modern we. But these ancient cultures, like you were talking about going to this necropolis, honoring the dead, they're part of life. And so we haven't done that. And so we have a pandemic, and we have the climate emergency, fires, floods, famines, hurricanes, all these amplified events that are bringing death. So to me, this, the mapping has to somehow keep the regional identity, the sounds of the place, and we have to see it together. So that's an app. I hope you'll invent for us. Yes.
I hope so. I think that maps really need to be looked at carefully, and they need to be multi-layered. I think maps like our history books have really done us in disservice. And I find that whenever I go to any of these places, frankly, anywhere in the world, I've told you my story of when I was at Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, and how disappointed I was and how cheated I felt by just the history of how it's been taught to us. Nobody mentioned how noisy it was because of the water. That it was never, we always talked about the form and the shape, and
yes.
And then you realize that this is not the right form for this forest. The forest is so beautiful. And this eyesore with its harsh corners sits there, and you think, no. But you don't realize, you see these gorgeous romanticized, nostalgic watercolor drawings, you see these gorgeous toned and shaded floor plans, and then you see this creature in your real life, and it's an eyesore, and it's noisy. When you're walking out inside, you don't have a moment of peace. I want to come home to peace and solitude and have it be a sanctuary. I don't want to feel like I'm drowning under some gushing river 24 hours of the day. I mean, it's fine once in a while, but anyway, so we will come back and speak to mapping. Instagram is telling me it's time for me to keep quiet. But I would also like to come back and discuss the Navajo connection for you and for me, the old ancient Native American thing, because there's something there that resonated, and we don't really get a chance to talk about that very often. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank
we're
you.
going to sign off right now. Have a good day wherever everyone is. Keep yourself safe. Masks on, social distancing done, whether you attend a protest or not, even if you're at home. And I will see you all hopefully on Thursday. I have a feeling the Thursday schedule will be the same as it is tonight. For the convenience of Wendy, it'll be 2 p.m. most likely, unless she has a preferred time, Eastern Standard Time, and 11 p.m. I will announce it to everyone, but thank you so much. Jean, thanks so much once again. Really, absolutely fantastic having you here with me. Really love your time and conversations. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Khuda Hafiz.
Bye.